In the field of biology, the Quran says in Surah Anbiya, chapter number 21, verse number 30, وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ hai? أَفَلَا يُؤْمِنُونَ? We have created every living thing from water. Will you not then believe? Who would have believed in the deserts of Arabia 14 years ago that the Quran says everything is made from water? Who would have believed? Today science tells us that all living creature is made up of cells. The basic component of cell is cytoplasm, which contains 80% water. All living creatures in the world, they are 50 to 90% water. And they survive on water. So Quran mentioned this 14 years ago, that we have made every living thing from water. Allah says in Surah Nur, chapter number 24, verse number 45, we have made every animal from water. Allah says in Surah Furqan, chapter 25, verse 54, we have made every human being from water. In the field of biology, previously we did not know that even the plants have got sexes, male and female. Allah says in the Quran, in Surah Taha, chapter 20, verse 53, it is Allah who sends down water from the skies. And He brings forth various colors of plants. He sends down water from the sky, and with it He brings various diverse pairs of plants. So the Quran says, the word used is azwaj, that even the plants have got sexes, male and female. Allah says in Surah Ra'd, chapter number 13, verse number 3, that Allah has made the fruits in pairs, male and female. Allah says in Surah Dariyat, chapter 51, verse 49, Allah has made everything in pairs. Not only animals, not only plants, not only human beings, even things like electricity. It has got male and female, proton and electron. Allah says in Surah Yasin, chapter 36, verse number 36, Allah has made everything in pairs, that which you know and that which you don't know. That means Allah is saying, not only has He made living creatures in pairs, He's made everything in pair. The things you know and things you don't know. In the field of zoology, the Quran says in Surah Anam, chapter 6, verse 38, that Allah has made every creature that walks on the earth, every animal that walks on the earth, and every bird that flies in the air to live in communities like the human being. And today science tells us that all the birds and animals, like the human being, they live in community. Quran says in Surah Nahl, chapter 16, verse 79, that do you see the birds held up in the sky? Who holds them up? But with the power of Allah. These are signs for the believer. Allah repeats the message in Surah Mulk, chapter number 67, verse number 19, that don't you look at the birds in the midst of the sky. They unfold, they spread their wings and they fold their wings. Who holds them up? But the power of Allah. The Arabic word used is amsak, holding up. And this holding is only done by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Professor Hamburger, he writes in his book, Flight and Fragility, that how birds, they take flights for days and weeks and months together. And he gives the example of mutton bird, which flies for 15,000 kilometers and takes a journey of 6 months and returns back to the same spot in not more than 1 week delay. Imagine 6 months flight. How can a young bird who has no experience, are they programmed? So Professor Hamburger says it cannot be possible until the genetic code is programmed. And who's the programmer? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No one can hold them up but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is mentioned in Surah Nahl, chapter number 16, verse number 60 and 69. Allah has taught the bees to build its cells in hills, trees, and human habitation, and to find the spacious path of thy Lord with great skill. What did Allah mean by saying to find the spacious path of thy Lord with great skill? Fonfresh got a Nobel Prize in 1973 to describe how the bees, they communicate with other bees the path of the new garden or the new flower they have found. So when they want to get nectar, one bee tells the other bee the exact location and the map of the new flower and the garden by a movement of the body known as bee dance. Allah said this 14 years ago. And the worker bee mentioned, previously we thought it was a male bee. Therefore Shakespeare in Henry V, when he writes that people talking, that the soldiers bee go and they report to the king, they are wrong. Today science tells us that the worker bee, the female bee, they don't report to the king, they report to the queen. And the female gender used in Surah Nahl chapter 16, verse number 6-9, it is a female gender. It is fasluki or kuli. Imagine even the gender of the worker bee is mentioned in the Quran 14 years ago, which we did not know that time. Quran says in Surah An-Kabut chapter 29, verse 41, that all those who take for protectors anyone besides Allah, they build for themselves houses like that of the spider. And verily, the house of the spider is fragile. So Quran says if you worship anyone besides the true God Allah, you're making yourself like house of spider, which is fragile, flimsy. Besides that, today science tells us, it also talks about the flimsy relationship. Many a times, the female spider kills the male spider and is called as the black widow. Quran says in Surah Nahl chapter 27, verse number 17 and 18, that when Solomon and his army and his host of jinns, men and birds, when they marched, when they approached a lowly valley of ants, one of the ants said, "Get ye into your habitation." One of the ants says to the other ants, "O ye ants, get ye into the habitation, lest Solomon and his army unknowingly will trample you beneath the feet." People will think, what type of a fairy tale book is the Quran? Ants talking about themselves? Today science tells us the animal or insect which has the closest resemblance to the human beings, it is the ant. The ant buries the dead the same way as the human beings do. They have a sophisticated method of labor where they have manager, they have supervisor, they have foreman, they have worker. They very often meet to chat. They have marketplaces where they exchange goods. You know how we have souk. There are marketplaces where they exchange goods. And if the grains they store, if it begins to bud, they cut the bud, they cut the roots, as though they knew that budding will cause the rotting of the grain. And if the grain gets wet, they get it in the sunlight to dry, as though they knew that humidity will cause the rotting of the grain. You know, sometimes we see the ants taking grain in the sunlight. What they're doing? They're going out to dry so that there's no humidity. It prevents the rotting of the grain. In the field of medicine, Allah says in Surah Nahl chapter 16, verse 60 and 69, that from the belly of the bee, you get a drink of varying colors in which it is healing for mankind. Today science tells us that in the honey, there are antiseptic properties. It is rich in fructose and vitamin K. No wonder the Russian soldiers in World War II, they used honey to cover up their wound, which, because of its antiseptic properties, the healing was done with very little scar. And because of the density of honey, germs and bacteria and fungus did not grow in the wound. In the field of physiology, 600 years after the Quran was revealed, Ibn Nafis describes the blood circulation to humankind. And 1,000 years after the Quran was revealed, 400 years after Ibn Nafis, William Harvey makes it common to the world. So we read in our school book, William Harvey, we don't read about Ibn Nafis. Ibn Nafis was the first human being. The food we eat, I'll say in a nutshell, the time is running short. The food we eat goes into the stomach. From the stomach goes into the intestine. From the intestine, the food constituents via the bloodstream can go into the liver. It's a complex method. It can go into the mammary glands, which produces the milk. So in a nutshell, it's talking about production of milk and the blood circulation. Quran says in Surah Nahl chapter 16 verse 66 that verily in the cattle is a lesson for you. We give you to drink for what is within the body, coming from a constituents of the excretion and the blood, the constituents of the intestine and blood. Milk, which is pure for you to drink. This blood circulation and the production of milk is given in a nutshell in the Quran. Allah repeats the message in Surah Mu'minun, chapter 23, verse number 21, that in the cattle example, we give you to drink for what is within the body, milk which is pure for you, and of the meat you can eat. In the field of embryology, there were a group of Arabs who followed the verse of the Quran, which says in Surah Nahl, chapter 16, verse 43, and Surah Anbiya, chapter number 21, verse number 7, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلِ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. If you don't know, ask the person who's knowledgeable. So they collected all the verses of the Quran and the Hadith, which deals with embryology, and they presented to Professor Keith Moore, who happened at that time. This was the late 1980s. Professor Keith Moore was head of the Department of Anatomy in the University of Toronto. And at that time, he was one of the highest authority of embryology. And he was asked to comment on these verses. So he said, all the translation that I read, I have no problem in accepting it's in conformity with modern embryology, except for the first two verses revealed. That is Surah Iqra, Surah Alaq, chapter 96, verse number 1 and 2, which says, Iqra bismi rabbika allazi khalaq. Khalaq al-insana min alaq. Read, recite, proclaim in the name of thy Lord who created human beings from something which clings, a leech-like substance. He said, I don't know whether the embryo in the initial stages looks like a leech or not. So he went in his laboratory and under a very powerful microscope observed the early stage of embryology and compared it with a photograph of a leech and was astonished at the striking resemblance. The early stages of embryo looked like a leech. And when 80 questions were asked to him, he said, if you had asked me these questions 30 years ago, means in late 80s, 30 years before that, I would not be able to answer more than 50% because embryology at that time was a new branch of medicine which had developed. Later on, in 1992, he writes the new information he gets from the Quran and the Hadith in his third edition of his book, The Developing Human Being, for which he gets an award for the best medical book written by any single author in that year. Quran says in Surah Hajj, chapter 22, verse number 5, and Surah Mu'minun, chapter number 23, verse number 14, that we have created the human being from a nutfa, a minute quantity of liquid, a trickle. And today science tells us that in one ejaculation, there are tens of millions of sperms. And only one spermatozoa is sufficient to fertilize the ovum. Nutfa. And again, Allah says in the Quran, in Surah Mu'minun, chapter number 23, says that we have created the human being from solala. Solala means a quintessence, the best part of the whole. So one sperm, the one spermatozoa out of tens of millions, the Quran refers to as solala, the best part of the whole. Quran also says in Surah Insan, chapter 76, verse number 2, we have created the human being from nutfatin amshaj, a mingled quantity of fluid, a minute quantity of mingled fluid. And we know that besides the male fluid, there's female fluid, there's spermatic fluid, which constitutes of the seminal vesicles, also the testicles, testicular fluid. So all this the Quran refers to as nutfatin amshaj, a minute quantity of mingled fluid. Today science tells us that the sex of the child is determined by the sperm, by the male. There are 23 pairs of chromosomes. If the 23rd pair is XX, it's a female. If it's XY, then it's a male. So if the male sperm, if the X takes part and the zygote is formed, it is a female. If the Y takes part, it becomes a male. So the male is responsible for the sex of the child. Allah says this in Surah Najm, chapter 53, verse number 45-46, that we made you into male and female from a minute quantity which is ejaculated. So when the word is used, the word Arabic word is tumna, coming forth from a male, it means the male fluid gives rise to the male and female. Allah says in Surah Insan, chapter 75, verse number 37 to 39. We have created the human beings into male and female from a minute quantity of sperm. Nutfatim min maniyumna. The Quran says a minute quantity of sperm. So the sperm is responsible for the sex of the child, not the ova. This Quran mentioned 1400 years ago. Furthermore, the Quran says that do not the human beings know from where they have been created? They have created from a drop coming forth from the backbone and the ribs. Today, science tells us that the genital organs in the male, that the testicles, and in the female, the ovary, in the embryonic age, they are developed from the space where the kidney is present between the backbone and the 11th and 12th rib. And in the adult, in the embryonic age, they descend. The ovaries descend till the true pelvis. In the male, via the inguinal canal, the testicles descend to the scrotum. In the adult life, even after the descent, they get the nerve supply from the same space between the backbone and 11th and 12th rib. They get the blood supply from the same space. Even the lymphatic drainage goes back to the same space. Imagine, Quran speaks so much detail. The Quran says in Surah Zumar, chapter 39, verse number 6, that we have created the human beings in the womb of the mother in 3 veils of darkness. So Professor Keith Moore says, these 3 veils of darkness the Quran refers to is the anterior abdominal wall, the uterine wall, and the amniochorionic membrane. The Quran says in Surah Mu'minun, chapter number 23, verse number 11 to 14, we have created the human being from a minute quantity of liquid, nutfa. We made from a quintessence of clay, then from a minute quantity of liquid nutfa, then made the nutfa into a mudga, a chewed-like lump. Then made the chewed-like lump into izaman, bones. Then we clothed the bones with flesh. Glory be to Allah, who's the best to create. And today science tells us that initially there is a minute quantity of liquid, it becomes the chewed-like lump. So Professor Keith Moore takes a plaster seal, makes it look like a leech, and bites it between his teeth, and the teeth marks, they resemble the somites. And then we made it into a bone, izaman, made the bones, clothed the bones with flesh, lahem. Glory be to Allah, who's the best to create. Till this time, the development, the embryonic development, whether it be in different animals, whether rabbit, whether fish, is the same as human being. After this stage, and Allah says, we have created, He's the best to create, a different creature. Then, the difference in the human figure comes out, the head, the arms, the legs. Further is mentioned in Surah Hajj chapter 22, verse number 5, that we have created the human being from a nutfa, then made it into a mudga, partly formed and partly unformed. When Professor Marshall Johnson, head of the anatomy department in Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, he was asked, what does it mean partly formed and partly unformed? He said that this stage, some of the organs in the embryo are completely formed, some are not completely formed. Some cells are differentiated, some are not differentiated. So if I say it's a complete creation, it is wrong. If I say incomplete, it is wrong. There is no better description than what the Quran gives in Surah Hajj, chapter 22, verse number 5, partly formed and partly unformed. Quran says in Surah Insan, chapter 76, verse number 2, that we have created the human beings and giving them the faculty of hearing and sight and feeling. Today science tells us, first comes the sense of hearing, then comes of sight, then comes feeling. We have come to know now. I would like to end my talk with giving 2 examples of the Quran. Allah says in the Quran, in Surah Insan, Allah says in Surah Qiyamah, chapter number 75, verse number 3, that when the unbelievers say, how will Allah be able to reconstruct our bones on the day of judgment? After we have died, we have been buried, how can He reconstruct our bones? So Allah says, Allah can not only reconstruct the bones, He can even reconstruct in perfect order the very tips of the finger. What does Allah mean by saying He can reconstruct in perfect order the very tips of the finger? It was Sir Francis Gould in 1880 who discovered the fingerprinting method. And he said, no 2 fingerprints, even in 1 billion human beings, are identical. And today, this fingerprinting method is used by CIA, FBI, and the police to identify the criminal. I would like to end my speech by giving the example of Prophet Tagrashon. Prophet Tagrashon he hails from Thailand, and he's a very famous doctor. Previously, we medical doctors, we thought that the pain was only felt because of the brain. Now we have come to know that there are certain receptors in the skin which are also responsible for feeling of the pain. So if a patient of burn injury comes, the doctor takes a pin and pricks it in that area. If he feels pain, the doctor is happy. It's a superficial burn. If he does not feel pain, the doctor is sad. It's a deep burn. Quran says in Surah Nisa chapter 4 verse 56, as to those who reject our signs, we shall cast them into the hellfire. And as often as the skins are roasted, we shall give them fresh skin so that you shall feel the pain. If you catch Hitler today and give him punishment, 6 million Jews incinerated, you can take revenge only of one or punishment of one. On the day of judgment, if Allah wants to burn Hitler 6 million times or 12 million times, he can do it. As often as your skins are roasted, we shall give them fresh skin so that you shall feel the pain, indicating there is something in the skin which are called as pain receptors. Prophet Tagrashon, when he read the translation of this verse, he was so impressed that in the 8th medical conference, Islamic medical conference in Riyadh, he said the Shahada, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah wa akhiru dawana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.